In this podcast episode, historian James Holland delves into the complexities of World War II, exploring the reasons behind the conflict, the motivations of key figures, and the strategies that ultimately led to victory for the Allies. Holland, a preeminent historian on the subject, provides insights into the ideological underpinnings of Nazi Germany, the political landscape of the time, and the military strategies employed by both the Axis and Allied powers. Holland begins by addressing the fundamental question of why World War II occurred. He attributes the war primarily to the expansionist ambitions of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, who sought to create a vast empire through aggressive territorial expansion. Central to Hitler's ideology was the concept of Lebensraum, or living space, which drove him to look eastward toward the resource-rich Soviet Union. Holland emphasizes that Hitler's virulent anti-Semitism and hatred of Bolshevism were intertwined in his worldview, leading to catastrophic consequences for millions. The discussion touches on the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I and imposed harsh reparations on Germany. This treaty fostered resentment and economic turmoil, contributing to the rise of extremist political movements, including the Nazis. Holland explains how the Wall Street crash of 1929 exacerbated Germany's economic woes, leading to political instability and the eventual ascent of Hitler to power in 1903. A significant point of contention in the podcast is the notion that peace could have been negotiated with Hitler. Holland firmly rejects this idea, arguing that appeasement was futile. He cites the failed attempts at diplomacy in 1938, which only emboldened Hitler's ambitions. The discussion highlights the absurdity of believing that a peace deal could have been struck with a regime that was fundamentally driven by an ideology of conquest and extermination. Holland also addresses the political dynamics in Britain during the late 1930s, particularly the role of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He explains that Chamberlain's policy of appeasement was largely driven by public sentiment, as the British populace was still reeling from the horrors of World War I and was largely against entering another conflict. The podcast emphasizes the difficulty of making decisive military decisions in a democratic context, especially when the majority of the population is opposed to war. As the war progressed, Britain found itself standing alone against Nazi Germany after the fall of France in 1940. Holland discusses the strategic challenges faced by Britain during this period, including the need to rearm and prepare for a potential invasion. He highlights the importance of the Royal Navy and Britain's geographical advantages as an island nation, which provided a buffer against invasion. The Battle of Britain is a focal point in the discussion, with Holland explaining how the Royal Air Force, RF, successfully defended against the Luftwaffe's aerial assaults. He notes that the British had developed the world's first fully coordinated air defense system, which allowed them to anticipate and counter German attacks effectively. The podcast underscores the significance of morale and the determination of the British people during this critical phase of the war. Holland shifts the conversation to the involvement of the United States, which initially maintained an isolationist stance. He explains how the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 galvanized American public opinion and led to a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy. The podcast highlights the importance of American industrial capacity and resources in supporting the Allied war effort. The discussion also touches on the moral implications of the war, particularly regarding the use of atomic bombs on Japan. Holland argues that the decision to drop the bombs was not merely punitive, but was driven by the desire to end the war swiftly and minimize further casualties. He emphasizes that the Japanese military was prepared to fight to the death, as evidenced by the fierce resistance encountered during battles in the Pacific. Throughout the podcast, Holland explores the complexities of warfare, including the challenges faced by both the Allies and the Axis powers. He discusses the strategic miscalculations made by Hitler, particularly in the invasion of the Soviet Union, which ultimately stretched German resources thin. Holland argues that the failure to secure a quick victory on the Eastern Front marked a turning point in the war. The conversation also delves into the moral dilemmas faced by military leaders and the impact of civilian casualties during bombing campaigns. Holland acknowledges the devastating effects of area bombing on German cities, but argues that these tactics were employed to disrupt the war effort and ultimately save lives by shortening the conflict.